Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Mute your microphone until you're ready to chat. That'd be great.
I'll just get everyone to make sure their microphone is muted, and then we'll get started here right away.
Okay, we're going to get started. We've got a lot of presenters today, which is great. So thank you for joining us today. This is our fourth and final webinar in our series on engaging with Sturgeon County agribusinesses. I'm Leanne McBain with Sturgeon County Economic Development, and we have some great presentations here to get you thinking outside of the box about ag innovation and clustering and all sorts of great stuff. So first of all, just go over a couple of quick notes. As Amy mentioned, if you can just keep your microphones muted, that just helps keep the conversation a little focused. And then if you do have a question, please just type it into the chat or just let us know you have a question. And Amy will read that for you as soon as we can. We're going to have a little bit of time after each presentation to direct your questions towards those presenters. And we are going to get going. So with that, I will turn it over to Sturgeon County Mayor Alanna Hnatiw.
Good morning and thank you. Welcome to those of you who are able to take some time out of the sunshine day. I hope this time proves worthy. I just want to do a quick shout out. I'm not sure if we have any others on council. So if we do, if you could just unmute and say hello.
Hello. Hi, it's... Oh.
Okay, go ahead, Deputy Mayor Como.
Yeah, just shout out. I guess that's what we're doing.
Okay, excellent, thanks. And then we have Councillor Toms, I believe.
Hi, yes, Councillor Toms.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And this is our fourth and final virtual workshop. So thank you to our Economic Development Department for setting this up. Obviously, engaging virtually like this is new for most of us, and it will be a learning experience for all of us. But again, I appreciate your ability to pivot and interface with us in these times. So, and to say that these are times of uncertainty is an understatement. But I think there are silver linings, obviously, to times of crisis like this. And so it's our hope that we can come together and discuss what the issues are and find where the opportunities are and be innovative and support you guys to find solutions, both municipally speaking and at hopefully advocating at the provincial and federal level if that's required as well. Obviously, in times of crisis like this, it is an opportunity for a community to come together and grow stronger, and that's certainly something that Sturgeon County Council is committed to supporting. So today we're considering that this is kind of a springboard to initiate some discussions and to engage and collaborate around what our ag business sector needs to do. So one, we want to identify how you're adapting, what you're doing to cope, and what you're doing to pivot during this difficult time. And two, to begin conversations to determine potential path forward and how Sturgeon County can support you in that. So to set the tone and context of today, I just want to give you a couple of statistics that you may or may not be familiar with. So Canada is the 5th largest ag exporter in the world. And the agriculture and agri-food industry employs 2.3 million Canadians. So 1 in every 8 jobs is related to the ag sector. Canada is one of the largest producers of flaxseed, canola, pulses, oats, and durum wheat. And Canada is the world's largest producer of dry peas and lentils, producing slightly over half of the world's lentils in 2017 as well. and Alberta ranks 3rd in Canada in contribution to the total Canadian food manufacturing sales. So the Canadian-wide, they're 95.7 billion, and Alberta contributed 13.6 billion to that. Value-added food processing and manufacturing employs over 18,000 people in Alberta annually as well, representing 14% of our annual workforce. So, you know, obviously in Sturgeon County, there's a long, proud history of agriculture, and with 480,000 acres in production with Class 1 soils throughout, we definitely have nature working on our side for the most part. So with that, also, and not far from where I am, we have the region's largest poultry production with 969,000 birds. And we are also home to the University of Alberta research farm, which does important work as well. So obviously, as stated, we have a strong ag business sector, and we have much to offer during these times of uncertainty. So we want to find out what we can do to navigate the form of the local food supply chain, as well as recognize the opportunities that there may be to enhance our existing agribusinesses so we can continue to flourish in what are some challenging times. So I look forward to the presenters today, and I look forward to the questions and input from those of you that could join us today. So thank you very much. And I'll mute my mic, and I'll also turn off my video so that we have some good bandwidth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Hnatiw. We are going to first hear from Sturgeon County's own Sharon Hoffman from our Agricultural Services Department. Sharon is the Rural Extension Coordinator with Agriculture Services and has worked for Sturgeon County for 6 years. Although her duties can be a mixed bag, her main focus is to provide programming to residents that includes relevant and current agricultural related information, helps to foster sustainable land management, and engages and promotes the agricultural sector. This can be achieved by hosting workshops, connecting residents with technical information, and through events. Thank you for joining us today, Sharon.
No problem. Thanks, Leanne. I'm just going to give a quick overview over some of the grant funding that's available through the Canadian Agriculture Partnership. So CAP, which was previously Growing Forward 2, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So this rolled out in 2018, and the cycle ends in 2023. A lot of these opportunities are a 50-50 cost share at the moment. So you will notice if you are familiar with it.
I think you just cut out there for a second. Can you just go back to the cost share part?
Oh, yeah. So most of these are 50-50 cost share projects. So if you're familiar with some of the grant funding, you'll notice a change there. They have lowered the cost share, but there is still some good items. So the first grant is the Environmental Stewardship and Climate Change Grant. So this grant helps producers to implement best management practices. So they have some funding that's surrounded around manure management, pesticide management, land and water assessments, shelter belt establishment, and grain bag rollers. So for this grant, you do need an environmental farm plan, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next slide. The next grant is the Farm Water Supply Grant. This grant supports producers to improve their water supply security and more efficiently manage their on-farm water resources. So the funding in this grant is surrounding new well construction, new dugout construction, off-source watering system, well decommissioning. And for this grant, you must have a long-term water management plan, and that can be done through Alberta Ag and Forestry. The Efficient Grain Dryer grant is still open, and this one focuses on grain dryer and grain drying system components that significantly improve energy efficiency. So it's anything above the standard configuration, and that's what's eligible under the program. So some of these items could be new equipment or retrofit installed on existing equipment. So like thermostats, high efficiency burners, enclosed dryer roofs, and even moisture monitoring cables. And for this grant, you do need an environmental farm plan as well. They are accepting applications for items that were purchased anytime after April 1st, 2018. The last grant is a newer one. They've made some changes. So it's the product to market grant, and they made the changes to help support producers throughout COVID-19. This grant is to support growth of Alberta's agriculture industries by supporting the development of new products and or processes. So commercialization of products in new markets and expansion into local, domestic, and international markets. So this grant can help with product and process development, label and package development, processing capacity expansion, market development, export preparation and planning, product demonstration, activities to support aggregation, and distribution of food. And this grant is also retroactive from April 1st, 2019. It targets producers who are adding value past primary agriculture production, people who are involved in international market development activities, bio-industrial producers, food processors, processor organizations, and producer organizations. So as I mentioned, some of the grants in the previous slide do require you to have an environmental farm plan. The environmental farm plan is a voluntary whole farm self-assessment tool. So it basically helps you evaluate what environmental risks exist within your operation. To be able to complete an environmental farm plan, you would just sign up through the ERICA website, and that is the association where the farm plans are housed. Once you sign up, an email will be sent out to the technician in your area, which is myself. And in the past, I've done one-on-one farm visits to complete the environmental farm plan. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that right now, but I can definitely help you on your way for the first few chapters, and I'm here if you have any questions throughout it. When your EFP is finished, you would submit it to me to review. I would go over it. If I had any questions, I would maybe send it back. If it's all good, then it would be approved and you would get your certificate of completion through email. The EFP does spit out an action plan. So this is just, it kind of creates a list of things that maybe you could have improved on based on how you answered the questions within the workbook. And from that, you create a plan on how you're realistically going to mitigate those risks. So some of the reasons you may want to complete an environmental farm plan is just that it basically informs you about sustainable production of your crops and hopefully leaving your farm for the next generation in good shape. It allows you to be eligible for funding, and also it demonstrates to the public, government, and lenders that you're managing environmental risks. I just wanted to let you know that the Sturgeon County Tree Program is going on right now. We are accepting orders until May 4th, and pickup day will be on May 8th. So if you were interested in doing some shoulder belt planting or riparian planting, you can order some trees through sturgeonservices.ca. We have moved to an online system, and if you have any troubles with that, you can just give us a call. We're also selling rain barrels and composters as well, and that you would need to order by April 29th, and the pickup day is May 1st. So we're getting close. And just our final slide, if you have any questions about any of the grant funding or environmental farm plans, my contact information is there. And then if you have any general inquiries about vegetation management, pest control, we do have our general agriculture services line as well.
Thanks, Shalane, that was awesome. Does anyone on the call have any questions for Shalane while she's here? Okay, so please feel free to reach out to Shalane. And with that, thank you. We're going to move on to our next presentation. So we have a presentation coming up from Canada West Foundation. And while I introduce you guys, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Carlo, this should allow you to share your screen if you like. I think it's at the bottom. There'll be a share screen button.
Yeah, I'm just looking on PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. And share. System preferences, security,
So
privacy to grant access.
just make sure your PowerPoint is open first. Is it?
It is. I'm ready to go. It's asked, sorry. You can tell that will not be able to record your screen until this quit.
Carlo Dade is the Director of the Trade and Investment Center for Canada West Foundation. As Director of the Trade and Investment Center, Carlo Dade develops and leads research to promote growth and profitability in Western Canada's export economy. Carlo has a long history in international public policy, most recently as Senior Fellow in the University of Ottawa's School of International Development and Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He is also a member of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. Carlo is a leading voice in debates on recent Canadian free trade agreements and development of trade infrastructure. He has a reputation for big picture thinking and is a leading global expert on Pan-Pacific trade, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Pacific Alliance trade blocs. He is one of Canada's leading commentators on North American competitiveness and Canada-Mexico relations. Carlo is a highly sought after media commentator throughout North America. And also joining Carlo will be Sharon Zeng-Sun of Canada West Foundation. Sharon Zeng-Sun specializes in research on international trade, investment, and trade infrastructure policy. She's a trade policy economist where she provides empirically sound analyses and policy recommendations. She has taken the lead on research projects, including the impact of Chinese industrial policy, Made in China 2025, on Canadian trade and Western Canadian export opportunities with Japan under the CPTPP. Other work includes the impact of trade agreements on trade infrastructure, addressing Chinese non-tariff barriers on Canadian agricultural exports, among other trade agreement and trade-related issues. Sharon is a PhD candidate at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. She has a background in international business and various international work experiences in business analysis, research, and consultation. Prior to joining the foundation, she was an associate researcher with the Center for Trade Policy and Law and an instructor at the Sprott School of Business. So welcome, Carlo and Sharon. Carlo, are you back? Everything's okay?
I'm back. Yes, you can thank Steve Jobs for that brief interruption. Security on Macs are very good, but also very annoying.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Leanne. Your worship, pleasure to be joining you folks virtually. What we'd like to do, what Sharon and I would like to do today is condense a much larger presentation that we give across Western Canada, always in person. I think this is the first one of these we've ever done by webinar. But to go over the current trade environment and to highlight some areas that may have impacts, will likely have impacts for the folks up in Sturgeon County, but also to plant ideas for questions. Again, there is a huge, immense wealth of information here We can cover a broad range of topics from the US to China to Europe or ties to markets in Mexico. So note that even though the presentation is focused, do not hesitate to ask questions about any of the broader ranges of the areas on trade. So with that, okay. Canada West Foundation, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we were created 50 years ago to be the think tank for Western Canada, to assure that the provinces in the West had the ability to present and articulate policy ideas and that reflected the unique needs and interests of the Western provinces in Ottawa, and increasingly as we go forward in all the markets where Western Canada reaches. So we do a lot of outreach and work in Washington, D.C., in Asia, Japan, and increasingly in China. So, of course, we always like to thank our funders, those who make the work that we do possible. Of course, we rely extensively on the government of Alberta, being based in Calgary, even though working for the four Western provinces. We do have a particular focus, obviously based on our location, on Calgary, on Alberta, and we spend a lot of time. Last time I gave this presentation was actually, believe it or not, up in High Prairie a few months ago, back before the outbreak. So today, overview of the current trade agreements very, very, very quickly. Sharon will talk about specific opportunities from new, unique research and unique modeling that we're doing, picking up where the federal government has dropped the ball on modeling that is of importance to Western Canada. And we'll talk briefly about some of the opportunities that this unique work is uncovering. And then I'll touch briefly to close out talking about our work on trade infrastructure. Indeed, about a good half of my time on the trade file is spent on trade infrastructure, and we've got some really interesting and important work taking part there. But to go into the major news on the trade front, the new NAFTA agreement, CUSMA, USMCA, we refuse to use those terms. We call it what it is, which is an update of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Look, the current prognosis was that with the agreement being ratified in all three countries, that the Americans were looking for a June 1st start. In addition to ratification, some work has to be done on assuring that the agreement can actually come into effect. That involves an exchange of letters between the three governments stating that specific domestic legislation has been put into place, specific changes have been made to domestic laws and regulations to allow the agreement to start. Canada has done that following Mexico. The Americans still have not. The Americans missed the legislative deadline to get this done by June 1st, and it's now a question as to whether or not they'll be able to get it done by July 1st. We had a meeting of an advisory group to U.S. Customs and Border that is now stating that the agreement will not be able to come into effect until January 1, 2021. Customs and Border in the States is pushing back, saying that they're still planning to try and meet the July 1st entry date, but that looks extremely, extremely doubtful with the work the Americans have to do and the work that they have dealing with COVID. So my guess is that we won't look at the new agreement coming into full effect until January 1st, 2021. But that should not, let me emphasize, should not mean any disruptions in cross-border trade flows or in any of the other things that we have under the old NAFTA agreement. So you're looking at a delay, most likely to January 2021, but I would not expect any impacts on movement of goods across the border from this. Obviously, COVID is different, but, and I certainly wouldn't expect any problems on the agricultural trade front. The CETA agreement, well, it's still being ratified by some countries in the European Union. But again, I expect no changes. The access that we have is not being altered, and I expect things to continue ongoing with our access to the European market. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, probably of these the most important agreement for the West. We're still looking at countries queuing up to join. Taiwan, independent economy, is looking to try and join. We have a couple other countries in Asia that are considering coming into the agreement. The United Kingdom would like to join as well, but that's on hold given the current crisis. I would note, though, that we have lost a couple countries. Malaysia has not ratified the final agreement, and the Latin American countries, Peru and Chile, have also not ratified. But the countries that are most important to Canada certainly are there. That would be Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore. So we still have a very good basis with the agreement. And what's most important in the agreement for Canada is there, and things are working very well with that agreement. It's a case of no news being good news. You haven't heard much about the TPP, but take that as good news, not a sign that things aren't working. The other agreements that you might have heard about, talks with the United Kingdom and Mercosur, the Southern Cone economies, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, etc. That is stalled. Talks on both fronts are stalled and likely not to go anywhere. The UK has to negotiate first with the European Union, then with the United States, and then they want to work their way towards Commonwealth countries like Canada. But I would not expect rapid progress on that, given the weakness of negotiating capacity in the United Kingdom. Again, the UK hasn't negotiated a trade agreement since they joined the European Union. They have no staff, no negotiators, no staff, no ministry. So they're starting from ground zero to try and build up trade capacity, and we often forget that here. And given that that capacity has to go towards the European Union and towards the US, don't expect a quick agreement or even talks with the UK. The Southern Cone, this would potentially be a threat to Western Canada, given the beef exports and grain exports coming out of Brazil and Argentina. But luckily for us, that's stalled, but that's something we really have to keep our eye on the West. So overall, again, we're still going to have access to North America, whether or not, or to the United States, whether or not the new NAFTA agreement is delayed. CETA, we're doing what we're doing with the current process of ratification, and the TPP is going fairly well. So overall on that front, the trade agreement is not a problem for us, especially in Western Canada. But very quickly, in thinking about the agreement and where we stand now, we need to realize that not only do we have a multilateral, multi-partner agreement with the Americans and the Mexicans, we have the same sort of arrangement with the Europeans in the EU and with the countries around Asia, extending our relationship with Mexico across the Pacific to Asia. So in essence, what we have are three versions of the North American agreement open to Canadian exporters. Multilateral agreements give several benefits for exporters. Integration into supply and production chains that extend to many countries, the ability to move people more easily, common rules of origin, all the things you're looking at when making decisions about whether or not to export. The cost benefit is not simply the cost benefit of using the rules to access the Japanese market, but the cost benefit of using one set of rules to access Japan, Vietnam, eventually Malaysia, Australia, and to have better rules for accessing Mexico and to tie it all together. Very quickly, thinking about plant protein and ingredients, the plant protein opportunity on which we spend a lot of time at Canada West and in Western Canada. The initial thinking with an agreement like the TPP is you would target the biggest and the richest market, Japan. That actually is not what makes most sense with a multilateral agreement. You would think instead to target Mexico. So this often causes confusion. Why target Mexico? We already have an agreement under NAFTA. Mexico is not as big or rich a market as Japan. Well, Mexico contains the world's largest bakery conglomerate, Grupo Bimbo, which also owns Canada Bread. If you can get into the supply and production chain for Grupo Bimbo and their products, you then have access, better access to all of the other TPP markets. So in terms of thinking about the agreement, we tend to think about agreements bilaterally. So I really like to use every opportunity to emphasize that we're really missing a lot by not considering the ability we have with our 3 NAFTAs to set up supply and production chains and to sell into other countries. And indeed, to take advantage of major corporations that are already selling into all these markets to be able to sell to them to access other markets. So great advantage that we have that we often miss. And now, with that, I will turn it over to Sharon.
Thanks, Carlo. Thank you. So I just want to talk about one of the key projects that we've been working on, which is identifying specific export opportunities that Western Canada, specifically Alberta, has with Japan under the CPTPP. So just to reiterate what Carlo has said about taking advantage of the 3 NAFTAs. One of the things that is important to do is to do the calculation and identify bilaterally what are the specific gains for each of the countries. And so we definitely need to do that not only with Japan, but with Mexico and all of the other CPTPP partners. But here for this project for now, we've done it for Japan. So with businesses in the economy taking a major hit, particularly right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to think about and to prepare for recovery for Alberta and also for the Sturgeon County. So what that means is particularly taking advantage of existing trade agreements such as the CPTPP rather than signing new free trade agreements. And I want to emphasize taking advantage of existing trade agreements because there are already tariff reductions and consistent rules in place that provides the market certainty, that provides the certainty for us to take advantage of when we think about the recovery. And one of the reasons why we're emphasizing on trade agreements so much is because of how significant trade is for the Canadian economy, particularly when we think about the recovery after COVID-19. So just to give you some background, 32.5% of Canadian export relative to the GDP is for Canada as of 2018, and two-way trade relative to GDP for Canada has been 64.9%. And of this export, 32.5% export, 11% are agriculture, and of this 11%, 53% is coming from Western Canada. So large part of the Canadian agricultural export to the world is coming from Western provinces. So as you can see in this slide, for Alberta, that's 17%. So together with another economist, Dan Churiak, who did the modeling for us, we examined which specific Canadian product experienced a tariff reduction with Japan under the new agreement CPTPP. And then we modeled the total expected export gain possible from Japan's tariff reduction. So for example, that could be roll oats. Carlo, can you change the next?
Sure.
Slide so I can actually talk about. Okay. So I just want to point out first that we did this modeling before the U.S.-Japan partial agreement. The U.S.-Japan partial agreement came into effect January of of this year. So we did the modeling before that, but because of the trade agreement, we had to later take into consideration of how that agreement would impact Canadian export to Japan in terms of competition. So what we've done is we compared Japan's tariff provisions under the US-Japan agreement with Japan's tariff provisions for us under the TPP. And so we identified that in column 7 in this table. You see how it says column 7, so for fresher chilled pork, for example, you have same if not worse. That means Canada has the same. It means that Canada has the same tariff reduction as the US, if not worse, which means the US would have an advantage over us, at least in terms of the tariff reduction schedule. So that's something that we've done to compare and take into consideration of potential competition from the US. So one of the contributions of our work here is this information hasn't been available at the sectoral provincial level and at a level of specificity that is useful for businesses. So all the way down to HS6 codes. So I think having identified this narrow list of opportunities by only looking at what has been reduced in terms of tariffs, this would allow export promotion agencies to more efficiently target businesses and also allow businesses to approach export promotion agencies themselves because they're able to openly access to this data. So let's look at some of the specific opportunities. In total, we've identified 84 already exported Alberta products that have tariff reductions. And out of the 84, 18 of them are expected to see over $1 million in gain. So as you can see here, that's that I put a rectangle over. Some of the top exports are pork and beef. And these are some of the largest gains. So segments of pork and beef, such as fresher chilled pork, frozen boneless beef, these are some of the largest gains for Alberta with Japan. Carlo, if you could click again. But of course, these are also some of the products that faces the largest competition from the U.S. Because it has because the U.S. has recently received similar tariff provisions. However, there is still opportunity. So just to point out as well for column 5 and 6, these are the historical baselines. So these are the 5-year average from 2014 to 2018 of how much Canadian export of fresher chilled pork to Japan, for example. So that's column 5 compared to column 6, which is the baseline of historic baseline of how much U.S. exports to Japan. So as you can see, most of these pork and beef products, U.S. exports more than we do. And now they have received the same, if not better, tariff provisions in Canada. That said, we've taken these results that we've calculated and gone over some of them with producers and industry specialists. So for example, for fresher chilled pork, yes, US is now having the same, if not better, tariff benefits. And yes, US has historically exported more than Canada, than Alberta. We've learned that Canada has gained traction over the US for this particular product. We see that Canada represents 40% of Japanese fresher chilled pork market after the US as of 2018. And so this is the same for certain beef segments as well, such as the chilled beef and for table meat. So there is opportunities because these industries have, because of the current targeted marketing strategies of these industries, coupled with the fact that we do have 13 months of tariff advantage over the US because because our TPP came into effect December 2018, and the US-Japan agreement only came into effect this January. So we have had an opportunity over the US to take advantage of the market, and we see that in the 2018 data just now, in terms of the growing market share that Canada has taken at the expense of the US. So just to talk a little, okay. So in terms of this slide, I also wanted to point out that there are other, just for pork and beef, for example, there are other opportunities that that Canada do perform better than the US currently already in the Japanese market. So that includes frozen bone-in ham and pig fat, for example. We already export a significant amount over the US in the last 5 years. And then we also have opportunities such as frozen beef offal and frozen beef tongue that has better provision. And what better provision means is that US and Japan, under the US-Japan Free Trade Agreement, they do not have any tariff advantages or provisions for the US for these goods. So not only do we have estimated gains, we also have a tariff provision that the US does not.
Yeah, okay. So did you have more or?
Yeah, I did have more, but I think it's the slide after yours.
Okay, so very quickly about the data, what we've done is model at a level of specificity that traditional modeling and the modeling by Foreign Affairs Canada has not done. So they generally model at the HS 2-digit level, so they can tell you fruits and vegetables. But what we've done is model at the HS 6-digit level, so we can do things like beef tongue frozen, whereas the modeling traditionally done by Foreign Affairs would just say livestock products or beef products. So this is a large database that contains product-specific information. So for producers, processors, and exporters, you know exactly which products you're producing. Our modeling matches your understanding of the products. This level of specificity matches what you're producing at processing plants or producing as producers. So this information now resides with the provincial authorities in the 4 Western provinces. So you can contact the government of Alberta on the agricultural side or on the trade side and ask them to run this information for you or ask them to use this database to help you while you're going out. We don't do that. We've turned the information over to them and we've worked with them and the same in Saskatchewan and Manitoba to allow them to be able to use this information. Very quickly, a note though about the Japanese opportunity and how important it is. This is a quick look at US agricultural exports. So the largest markets to which US producers sell and transport goods. You can see that in the US case, it is fairly diversified. About a third to North America, a third to the rest of the world, and a third split amongst large producers, including China. The case in Canada, though, is quite different in terms of agricultural exports. We are overwhelmingly, and I would argue dangerously, dependent upon the US. You look at the problems that the Americans have been having and the problems that we've been having in terms of vulnerability of our agricultural exports, and you can see that our lack of diversification is certainly an issue. Now, there are reasons for this, obviously. The size of the US economy is larger. They grow a heck of a lot more oranges and avocados than do we. So there are structural reasons for this. But despite those structural reasons, this is just a good reminder of how dependent we are on the US economy. And as we've been very, very, very strident on, this dependency is not mitigated by the new North American trade agreement. The greatest threat we have in terms of access to the US market are actions by the US administration, by the president. We've done an extensive amount of work to understand the unique unilateral authority that the US president has to close borders, to impose tariffs, and to stop trade. And indeed, for all sectors of the Canadian economy, with the exception of autos, which we just negotiated protections for, and the petroleum industry, which has protections due to domestic issues in the US back in the 1970s. The rest of the US, our trade with the US is subject to the type of threat that we've seen in national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, national security tariffs on autos, and President Trump's threat to close the border with Mexico last summer, which caught markets by surprise. So for agriculture, this is something to keep an eye on and something we really have to watch out for. Should issues spark with the US on the agricultural front, the administration does, despite the presence of the new trade agreement, the administration, so President Trump, has the ability to clamp the border down. Very quickly, in terms of accessing the opportunities that we have in Japan and the other TPP markets, opportunities about which we should really be excited, we still face a major problem in Canada. And this is how I envision our time spent in Asia. We spend half our time beating down the doors, working on market access, and then our trade representatives and government officials and industry spend the other half of the time in dogeza, or the Japanese term for deep, profound apology for failing to be able to deliver goods on time. This has really harmed our reputation in Asia, in key markets. If you look at the World Economic Forum or the World Bank's Logistic Performance Index, if you follow these, you couldn't have missed that last year was the year Canada fell off the cliff in terms of global perceptions of dependability of trade infrastructure. Now, we've written about this at Canada West. We'll provide the link so you can go back and look at the reports and the data. But we dropped from a high of being perceived to have the 10th best trade infrastructure globally, the 10th best back when we had the Asia Pacific Gateway, to muddling through the past decade around 15th best in the world, to dropping to 32nd last year. So literally, we've had a strong signal from foreign markets. And this isn't a quantitative analysis. It's not people standing by roadsides with clipboards measuring trucks. It's a measure of perception of users of the trade infrastructure system, including foreign buyers, of how reliable they think we are. And indeed, last year was the year where decades of problems here in Canada finally caught up with us, and our rankings fell off the roof. Fell through the floor. So this is a major issue and a major concern. We're doing a lot of work on this at Canada West, but as we come out of the COVID crisis and we look to rebuild our economy and we look to exports to lead the recovery in terms of generating income, the services sector is shot. Oil is facing a global glut. We're going to have to rely on exports and exports of commodities, more than likely, to lead the recovery. Yet, we have major problems with foreign buyers and perception of our reliability. So we're doing some critical work with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian Construction Association, the Western Road Builders Association, and others, to put forward policies that can improve the way we understand the movement of trade and adopting best practice from around the globe. Again, with modeling, we've modeled the impact of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on our trade infrastructure, so we now have data to inform decision-making about what needs to be done. This is data that hasn't existed in the past. It's data that the federal government has neglected to do and has actually refused to do in the case of the TPP. And we've had to step in to fund the modeling to pick up the ball in that regard. So lots of exciting stuff happening on our end. I know this is a ton of information, but I would leave you with two things. Product-specific information about access to Japan under the TPP. Huge market, third largest economy on the planet. We have better access than the Americans, and now we have better information than the Americans or anyone else about our opportunities. That information is at the product level. So extremely specific information that matches what producers, processors, and others are putting out, and information that they can use. That's with the provincial authorities. You can go to them for a new level of help and a new level of analysis. And Leanne, that was way too much, but it's also about half what we normally give. So I'll cut it there, and I'll share links with you to the other publications and resources.
And I just wanted to add also that I wanted to go deeper because we talked about, I was talking about pork and beef because those were the largest identified gains, but there are a lot of more interesting numbers for like frozen potatoes, natural honey, pulses, grain like rolled or flaked oats, dried shell peas. These are all some of the sectors that we have exported less to Japan that are seeing significant gains. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I would be happy to go over some of these opportunities during Q&A.
Thank you, guys. I know this is a ton of information. We really appreciate it. This is wonderful. I'd just like to open it up for questions. Would anyone like to ask either Sharon or Carlo a question?
Go ahead, Kristen.
Hi, thanks. So this is with respect to the trade infrastructure measurement. I was just curious as to what you think led to that rather large deterioration in the perception internationally of us to 37th, and what you see as the fastest way to start fixing that perception.
Sure. Very quickly, it's a combination of two factors. It's the incidents, the problems we've had moving grain and other commodities in the winter. So the accumulation of delays in shipments, the accumulation of problems in reliability in delivering, especially in Japan and other markets in Asia. It was a gradual accumulation of those problems. The blockade that we experienced late last year, certainly didn't help and made things worse. But that wouldn't have factored into the fall. But obviously, you can imagine that adding to it. So the half are the incidents. The other half is the perception that we do not have a handle on the problem. Our approach is to ex post facto, or reactively respond to blockages, reactively respond to bottlenecks. We do not have a handle on being able to predict where these bottlenecks will occur, and we do not have a long-term plan for funding trade infrastructure, for prioritizing projects, for aligning projects to fit with a national supply and logistics system. So we have a haphazard, reactive, piecemeal approach where competitors like Australia have spent close to a decade working on a proactive approach, looking at a national system for moving goods, identifying projects, prioritizing them, assuring that the projects will be done, will be sequenced to fit in with other projects, and will maximize investment. We have none of this. And I think it's the lack of that overall system that contributes to the perception that we don't understand the problem, we don't have a handle on it, and we don't have the capacity to deal with it in a proactive manner. So to my mind, it's those two factors. And the work that we're doing is modifying or taking what Infrastructure Australia's done, what we did in Canada with the Asia Pacific Gateway, updating it and making it permanent so we can bring in private sector supply and logistic information, with public sector and policymakers to set up project pipelines and to convince, well, to improve the way we move goods, but also to convince foreign markets that we have a handle on the problem.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Go ahead, Mayor Hnatiw, with your question.
Thank you. A lot of great information that's worth some follow-up. Just a question as far as your opinion of doing more home or closer to home processing so that we're not necessarily exporting the raw commodities, and if that somehow insulates us against the politicization of some of the trade decisions that we've fallen victim to, if we're shipping or exporting an ingredient instead of a raw commodity.
Right. So raw commodities, ingredients, consumer goods, you have an array of choices along that spectrum. The unique opportunity, I think, and each one has problems associated with it. We're very familiar with the problems in exporting raw commodities, not as familiar with the problems with ingredients, and we're even further from the problems associated with exporting consumer processed goods. So if you were to talk to the folks in Ontario, they would give you an earful about the risk and the problems they're having with final consumer goods. I think for Western Canada, the niche for us is to move up the value chain from raw commodities to diversify into ingredients and intermediary inputs for processing. So this is what we're looking at with plant proteins and ingredients. It is a large step up in value added that ties us into things like the Impossible Burger and things like that, but keeps us out of the worries of having to deal with the peculiarities of the final consumer product. So plant protein and ingredients, huge opportunity for us to move up the value chain and to stay away from the risk with consumer products and dealing with the consumer market. So there's been emphasis on that in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Our argument is that we really have to focus a lot more attention on that and developing that opportunity. And we've published extensively on this. We did the initial foundational research that led to the establishment of the plant protein supercluster. So that information is available. But Alberta has some advantages in plant protein and ingredients, transportation advantages, water advantages in parts of the province, workforce advantages. And we also have a level of understanding of the opportunity at the grassroots level, at the community level, at the regional level, through the Plant Protein Alliance of Alberta. So if you're not familiar with PPAA, I would really strongly urge that you get in contact with PPAA. I happen to be a board member, but we have a unique advantage in Alberta that Saskatchewan and Manitoba do not have in having a provincial organization of producers and researchers on plant protein that's very active.
And also just to add, in addition to plant protein, there is a lot of discussions right now just in terms of self-sustainability with the current pandemic, in terms of increasing our own manufacturing and our own processing, just because we've been so reliant on the US and we have such a integrated supply chain with the US. So that being said, I think our modeling here in terms for some of these sectors, for example, we see tremendous gains in canola oil exports, not just canola seeds, because, for example, for canola seed with Japan, there's already no tariff restrictions, and so in this agreement we see the alleviation of tariff restrictions for things like canola oil. And so speaking with the Canola Council as well, they do see an increase in that area, so as to contribute to product diversification. And so I think from this perspective, if we have the capacity and ability to, it is definitely an opportunity for us to focus on and to consider.
And one quick note, we've done a lot of work on food processing for Alberta, small scale food processing. We produced work for the provincial government that we really haven't made public, but we're also for the provincial government looking at how to increase food processing in a regional context. So looking at interprovincial trade barriers and what can be done to increase food processing for export in a regional New West partnership sort of context. So your ability to move product from across the street in Lloydminster, to be very blunt about it. But so that research is underway and will be out fairly soon. And we've done farmers market surveys in Alberta, looking at issues that producers and processors for farmers markets have had in increasing processing. So the province is working on the larger issue, and we've taken a smaller piece looking at specific issues such as interprovincial trade barriers and increasing really small scale farmers market type of producers. Again, not the vegetable sellers in farmers markets, but the folks who are in farmers markets all year round selling processed food goods.
Thank you for that. So do you see some restrictive issues, overly restrictive issues brought about through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency?
Oh, God. Yes, sorry. That was a laugh of frustration.
Yeah.
Yes. And, so we're looking at ways as to kind of more radical ideas on how to deal with that, how to get over the barrier for HSP or the new health and safety requirements that are required. So again, that work is underway and should be turned over to the province sometime soon.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for your information.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So are we, you're muted, Leanne.
Sorry
There you
about
go.
that. That is some great conversation. Thank you guys so much. And we will be posting some information on our website as well as a recording of this probably early next week. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and also on this brand new platform that we're trying to work on. So appreciate you joining us virtually and making it happen today.
Well, thank you for having us, and look forward to seeing you guys in person when this is a bit further behind us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So can I just get you to stop sharing your screen and then we'll put it back to ours. Perfect. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our next presentation from David Arthurs of Hickling Arthurs Lowe. He is the president of HAL and specializes in economic analysis, policy development, and strategic planning for the public sector science and technology organizations. He has significant experience with research and analysis of regional economic development and industry clusters, and has led a number of studies dealing with agri-food and agri-bio economies. David holds a PhD from Queen's University, where his studies focused on the economics of technological innovation, and an engineering degree from the University of Waterloo. Thanks for your time, David, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you. Is my presentation showing up there?
It is, yep. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to give just a short introduction to cluster theory and some of the steps that a region might go through to
start to develop a cluster or to improve their cluster. It's a somewhat generic presentation, but I'll provide some examples from work we've done in Southern Ontario in the agricultural sector. This is possibly a good time to talk about such things because a lot of clusters start up out of some sort of disruption or discomfort, and certainly everybody's experiencing that now. I'm going to have two parts to the presentation. The first part is just going to give an introduction to clusters as a framework for regional economic development. So there'll be a little bit of theory here to tell you what a cluster is and why one might be interested in it. And then the second half, we'll talk about an approach to cluster development and the steps that one might want to take. And that's where I'll bring in the examples from Southern Ontario. So what is a cluster? Academic theory says it's a geographic concentration of interconnected companies and the other parts of the economy that support those companies. So important here is the concept of geography and the idea that clusters have to have some proximity. And the second part is interconnectedness. And that means that these players in a cluster are interacting through both traded and untraded relationships. Traded means transfer of money in some way, and untraded means ways of interacting that don't involve money. There are a lot of different related concepts, and the term cluster has come and gone in fashion over the years. Similar concepts are economic ecosystems, innovation systems, regional economic development, etc. So choose the term that you feel most comfortable with. I, in the past, have not been a big fan of the word cluster, but as was mentioned in the previous presentation, the word cluster is back in vogue because the federal government has their supercluster initiative, and one of those is the plant protein industry supercluster, which is focused on the prairies. In fact, the supercluster concept is not really clusters in the manner that I'm going to explain to you, partly because the regions that they're focused on are a little bit large and do some damage to the academic concept. So why would one care? The pursuit of clusters is a pursuit of competitive advantage. And research has shown that being geographically concentrated does bring advantages to firms. Three in particular I'll mention. One is access to specialized labor. So when you have a concentration of companies doing something, then you tend to have concentrations of people which can move among the organizations. Similarly, you have concentrations of specialized providers of inputs and services that the cluster requires. And finally, you often see access to local sources of specialized knowledge and research. Knowledge can be both what often people think of in terms of technical knowledge, codified knowledge, but it can also be tacit knowledge, just knowledge of ways and means of doing things. So all three of these are ways that you get specialized resources that are available to this concentration of firms. And all of that means that you can measure an impact in the region in terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, productivity, etc. So once you've got this idea that you'd like to pursue competitive advantage, what helps contribute to cluster development? Among the things are, first of all, local champions. So you want people that are going to drive this vision forward. in addition to particular champions, you want institutions that will facilitate growth of the cluster. It helps to have infrastructure, and in particular knowledge infrastructure, and often this takes the form of research universities and government labs, etc. As has been mentioned, technology and in particular knowledge and skills of the local labor pool. In the famous clusters around the world, there's typically a large, at least one, if not more, large anchor firms which are exporting and have global reach. And then you have the specialized resources, and in particular financing, and people who can contribute money, who understand the ways that the industry works. All of this comes together if you can manage to develop strategies that align what people are doing and the vision of it all. And finally, a supportive business climate and policy conditions. Often that business climate and the policy come from layers of government beyond the local. So if you're talking about a cluster in a region, usually the business climate and policy result from actions at the provincial and federal levels. So clusters go through different stages. And the nice thing about this life cycle model is that no matter where you are, you can consider yourself a cluster. So if you really don't exist yet, you're defined as a latent cluster, a wannabe cluster. Then there are the stages where you're actively developing yourselves as a cluster, and you're in the developing cycle. There are the established clusters, many of which are famous now, and everybody thinks of places like Silicon Valley. And as in all things in life, eventually, due to changes both internally and externally, the cluster may start to fade, and then you become a transformational cluster and hopefully reinvent yourselves for the next life cycle. So lessons from what we've learned examining clusters all over the world. Cluster strategies are not a panacea for solving whatever problems and challenges you're facing. There are no quick and easy solutions. However, they may help. One size does not fit all, which means you have to look very carefully at your own situation, assess your strengths and your challenges and your opportunities, and implement these strategies in a way that's suitable for what you're facing. Their clusters evolve through both top-down and bottom-up strategies. Governments sometimes try to impose clusters in sectors, the supercluster perhaps being a good example of this. But evidence shows that you can't just impose it from top. You have to involve local actors. The flip side of that is that if the local actors want to do something, that's great, but it really helps to have the support of layers of government above that. So you want to coordinate both this top-down and bottom-up approach. And finally, cluster strategies need to be iterative. The world's always changing. What works now is going to have to change to adapt to evolution in both the internal aspects of the cluster and the external realities. So that's the theory. If one were interested in pursuing this, then I'm going to give you a brief overview of a six-step process. And the first of those is involve. You want to involve as many people and organizations as you can. And you need to involve them locally and then right up the food chain. So to do that, you need, first of all, leadership. You need someone who's leading the charge and can be the spokesperson for the initiative. You need to assemble your core partners. These are typically the members of the cluster, so the firms involved in the sector that is of interest. Then there are the local collaborators. So these can be the facilitators or the other parts of the sector, the support services and suppliers to the core partners. And then the wider facilitators. And these typically come from the public sector or the academic sector, and they can be regional, provincial, or national. And then finally, to be a successful cluster, you want to think internationally, so you need to work on your international linkages. The second step is to assess where you are. And as I've been saying, you want to assess both your internal capabilities and the external environment, and in particular, the external competition. So you also want to look at what sources you can get for assistance. Assistance can be resources and in particular financing, but it can also be infrastructure and advice and things like market access. I'll just point out on the right here, we have an example from work we did for the Ontario government in Southern Ontario. This is a map of the organizations and their interconnectedness that are involved in innovation in agri-tech. This isn't just the agriculture organizations, this is very focused on innovation. And you can see that it's a complicated situation with a large number of players. And I've sort of blurred out the details, but you can see that at the top level, the types of organizations that are involved. So this is an example of the type of thing you might want to do for your own cluster. Third on the list is to prioritize. So prioritization is about, once you've got an idea of what your situation is, what are you going to do about it? And since you can't do everything, you need to figure out what's most important and what's less important, and in what order you're going to do things It helps if you have a common vision for where you're going, because that's going to drive the prioritization. On the right here, we have the vision and mission statements that the City of Guelph developed when they were doing a cluster building exercise. And that'll give you some sense of what a vision and mission is all about, and how it guides the work you're going to do. So once you have this vision, once you hopefully have people more or less working towards the same objective, then you need to start planning and figuring out what the scope is of your initiative, what are the activities that are going to allow you to achieve your vision, who's going to be involved, and in particular, who's responsible for each of the activities that have been defined, when these activities are going to occur, and how they're going to be done. And in particular, what resources need to be brought to bear, and where are those resources going to come from. So again, on the right here, we have an example from the Ontario Strategic Plan. And we developed, first of all, a definition of the agriculture subsectors we were looking at. So agrochemicals, agri-health, agri-materials, agri-energy. We looked at where there were players through the value chain in each of those subsectors, what could be done to develop the industry in terms of expanding it, bringing in new players, creating new companies from scratch, etc. And how research and how the research institutions could support all that, what programs existed to support it, and what policy and regulations needed to be brought to bear or changed to support it. So this was all pretty complex in the end, but it helped everybody know what they needed to do to achieve the vision. Once you have a plan, then you need to implement it. This is the stage that as a firm we're less involved in. This is where we turn it off over to the other organizations. There may be a cluster organization within the sector. There may be a local economic development organization that guides the whole process. And you need some governance of all the players. You need to constantly monitor what's happening, both internally and externally, consult on an ongoing basis with the stakeholders, and adapt the plan as things change. Because plans are only correct when things start, and then everything quickly changes. So there's a diagram that shows what we did in Ontario, how we were trying to move the agri-food economy into the bioeconomy, and what were the different components that we were trying to get to work together. And finally, both at the start and at the end, and probably different points in between, you want to be evaluating. So this is an example of a formal process we have for evaluating how well a cluster is doing and giving some sense of what its strengths and weaknesses are. On the right, there's a diagram that shows 6 metric categories, but in particular, those are in 2 sets of 3. One set is the current conditions within the cluster, and the other set is the current performance of the cluster. And of course, current conditions determine future performance, and past conditions are what determine current performance. And at any point in time, those two aren't in sync. So it helps to measure at different points in time so you can see how conditions are affecting what happens in the future. There's a large number of metrics that we measure. We've got tools and instruments to do that. I'll just focus on 3 measures that are particularly important because they're not all of equal weight. First is identity. And identity has 2 components. What do the members of the cluster think of the cluster themselves? Do they view themselves, in fact, as members of the cluster? Do they view themselves as working together to a common vision? The second component is what does the outside world think of you? And do they recognize you as a cluster? And those 2 work off of each other. The second most important thing is critical mass, which not surprisingly is tied to identity. So if you have a large number of firms and they're doing lots of good business and they're exporting and the world knows about them, it's more likely they're going to be identified as, in fact, a cluster. And finally, a cluster is really only a cluster if there are linkages among the different players, because otherwise it's just a bunch of firms. So the degree to which there are linkages, those can be formal linkages where the firms are actually working together, but there's always going to be competition, so that's not vital. But there's also linkages if, for example, you have small entrepreneurial firms spinning out of large firms. There are linkages if you have a lot of flow of labor among the firms in the cluster, et cetera. There's a lot of ways you can realize linkages. So that's my brief overview. Be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions for David? Okay. Looks like I think there are none. So we will move on. Thank you so much, David. We appreciate your presentation, and I agree it's a huge topic for a 30-minute wrap up, but thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Madam Mayor would like to ask you a question.
Thank you for the presentation on clustering. So are you aware of how many egg clusters there are across Canada?
I am not.
Okay.
Are there, to truthfully answer that, I mean, I'm not, is the simple answer, but there's also a question of how one would define, say, an egg cluster, because the first way to do it is just to say, where are there geographically proximate egg farmers? But that doesn't necessarily mean they're operating as a cluster.
Right. Okay. I guess I'm just thinking of some place where there's intentionally been a location of taking a commodity and moving it through the value chain just in some degree.
Right. So I do know that in Southern Ontario, where we've done most of our work, there are a lot of egg farmers. Nowhere was that ever brought to our attention as being a cluster.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation.
All right, are there any other questions? Okay, thank you so much, David. We appreciate your presentation. And again, I will be posting David's PowerPoint on our website later. Okay, so we're going to move to our last presenter today. Our last presenter is Neil Blue. He is the crop market analyst for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Neil was raised on a grain and cattle farm near Hardisty, Alberta, graduated from the University of Alberta with a degree in agriculture, and he's farmed in the Vermilion area since 1981. Neil has worked at several contract and employment positions with Farm Credit Corporation, Alberta Agriculture, and the Alberta Canola Producers Commission. He has helped numerous farm families with their financial and marketing management, and has applied those management strategies to his own farm operation in both the crop and cattle enterprises. He's currently working as the provincial crop market analyst with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Welcome, Neil. So,
thank you, Leanne.
Here you are. Perfect. Okay. And are you able to share your screen?
Sure, sorry.
I think
there we go.
Perfect.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Leanne, for the invitation to present this afternoon, and thank you to the other presenters. I've very much enjoyed the presentations that I've viewed here so far. I have a lot of slides, but I'll go through these fairly quickly, and you're welcome to ask me some questions at the end if you have any. Okay, so there are lots of items that affect markets, as a lot of you would already know. Economic conditions, politics, world population and consumption trends, which is a longer term factor, the ethanol biofuel mandates, currencies, and of course, last but not least, weather. I'm going to go through these quickly, and then I'll get to some comments on specific crops. So one of the economic indicators, although it's just an indicator, is the stock market. This is a graph of the US stock market going back to the recovery that started in March 2009, and it's taken quite a bit of drop lately in volatility, but that X by the 2800 level is kind of where we've recovered to currently. So there seems to be a bit of recovery underway, although part of it could be an anticipation of the effect of the government money that's been kind of thrown at the C-19 problem currently. This is the Toronto Exchange and what's been going on there. Of course, it's affected in a great way by what's going on with the oil industry, which has not, of course, been good. The social media has quite an effect on the markets, and more particularly what comes out of the US. And so markets can go either down or up depending on what day it is and what comes out of the White House, it seems like. Already mentioned was the difficulty in rail movement and the effect it's had on our reputation as a supplier in the export markets. We had a rail strike early in this winter, and then later on we had the blockades, which were allowed to proceed and eventually ended. But in the meantime, there was quite a bit of damage done. In a way, we've had a bit of a benefit on the grain side with the C-19 situation because of the slowdown in movement other than grain. And so because of the slowdown in oil and other factors, we've had an increase in grain exports. And so we've, for the most part, caught up with a lot of that which we were behind with on the grain export movement. Of course, we've got the coronavirus situation, and you're all quite familiar likely with this map, and it's had quite an effect too on our markets. In the world population situation, world population increase is declining as shown in the red line there, but the total population in the world is still increasing. That population, particularly in the developing countries, is eating more meat. And that desire for more meat has quite an impact on the need for feed grains. And so that has been supportive in the longer term, at least for feed grain demand. One of the biggest factors that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is the US biofuel mandate. And back in about 2006, it really started to have an impact on our grain demand, particularly corn. That had an impact across the world, including Canada, on our grain markets. And it was a positive impact on demand and price. That has continued until just lately when we've had quite a drop in ethanol demand because of the drop in gasoline usage across the world, and particularly in North America, is affecting the US ethanol industry. So that's a really negative effect on corn use, and it's had some impacts on price. So this is a graph of the US ethanol futures, and you can see what's happened in the recent drop in the value of those. But even going into the COVID situation, there was a drop in ethanol prices, and some of the producers in the US were again struggling. They also struggled back in the earlier part of this last decade because of higher corn prices, and that affected their profitability to quite an extent, and some of them ran into financial difficulty at that time as well. The currencies, the Canadian dollar has been weak, particularly relating to this last month or so and the drop in oil prices. The weaker Canadian dollar has buffered us to quite an extent from what has been going on in the US with the farm prices and their economics of farming down there, or grain farming at least. But it's buffered us, even though we don't have a great economic situation in agriculture on crops or livestock, and certainly not good lately on livestock particularly. But it has buffered us to quite an extent from what we could have been facing with a stronger dollar relative to the US. In terms of what's been going on in the Canadian dollar, I wanted to point out the effect that the crude oil price, and this is just a graph showing the comparison to West Texas intermediate crude, and its effect on our Canadian dollar. So quite sensitive in our economy in Canada to what's going on with oil prices. So just a reminder. In terms of weather, excessively wet fall last fall in the US and also Canada. In Canada and Alberta specifically, we were wet for the most part from July through September, and the farmers on the call would already be quite aware of that and the difficulties that caused. This is the crop report from Alberta Agriculture. It was the last crop report of last fall, and this is the summary for Alberta crop by crop, and more specifically, it shows that we were down on our harvest, and we had probably 10 or so % of the crop left out in the field. That continues to this day. There was some progress made during the winter, but we're still facing a crop of about 10% of our wheat, 8 to 10, and a significantly higher amount on canola acreage left out there. So that is just maybe getting underway now in some areas, but the late spring here has delayed that start in our completion of harvest from last fall. So it's a very busy time coming up ahead for farmers here. Some more specific comments on crops, and starting off with wheat. From a world perspective, the 5-year wrap-up of a few years back now where we had wheat production exceed usage 5 consecutive years, led to a situation we have now where we still have high world wheat stocks, and that is price depressing for the most part. So we've got world wheat stocks projected in this current year at record high, and that is a bit of a factor in trying to compete out there in the world market. And the the U.S. situation, similar, but because of lower wheat acreage, because of the lower prices in the U.S., that has been somewhat alleviated, but nonetheless, the U.S. stocks are still quite high as well. One of the big factors is the former Soviet Union countries and the increase over there in their wheat production. Specifically here, I'm showing Russian wheat production, which hit record high a couple years ago. And this current year, and that there's a lot of winter wheat growing out there, they just recently reduced the estimated crop to about 75 million tons, which is still going to be potentially the second largest crop in history. And Russia and Ukraine have been very aggressive in wheat exports, particularly into that strong market of North Africa. So because of their situation located closer to those markets, they've been able to out-compete Canada and the US in those markets, thinking particularly of Egypt. Okay, on the wheat front, this is a graph, current graph of the May Minneapolis wheat futures, and it hit new lows earlier this week. It's since recovered slightly, but it's down right near the lows right now. So that's reflecting the difficulty this year in the US getting those exports out to market. Something else I wanted to point out on these wheat futures is this carrying charge market. So if you look at those numbers May through next March, you can see higher and higher prices going out in time. For those of you not familiar with it, take a look at the July 2020 price of 516/4. That 4 is a fraction. It means 4/8, which translates into 1/2 for me. So I just wanted to point out that carrying charge market, that's a sign of a well-supplied market, but it's also at times provides opportunities. You can, as a farmer, forward contract out into that future and capture some of that carry that otherwise, as time passes, would just get eroded away. So that's a factor you can take a look at in a carrying charge market, is to forward price, and using either the futures, options market, or even cash price contracting, depending on that front on cash prices, how much of the forward price on the futures is being conveyed to a producer with considerations of basis levels. So that's just something I wanted to point out there on those markets. In terms of Canadian wheat acreage, was a jump last year, and our production was quite similar, and that's yet to be dependent in part on what happens with the remaining spring harvest. In terms of carryover, probably we'll see an increase this year because of the lower exports that we're experiencing this year. We're down about 1.5 million tons on Canadian wheat exports so far. In terms of milling wheat prices, we had been lower last fall, and so we did recover. It's been seesawing back and forth a bit, but nonetheless, not terrific wheat prices compared with what we would like and what we need to be highly profitable for sure. So to summarize on wheat markets, world wheat supplies are still very large. There are protein premiums that developed last fall when it became apparent that protein was taking a bit of a hit because of the weather. As I mentioned, Russia and former Soviet Union countries are continuing to be quite price aggressive, although in the news this week has been suggestions that Russia just recently announced that they'll cut back once they hit their quota for the year, but their year end is just coming right up, so that isn't a major market factor, although it caused the market to run up on this past Monday, temporarily at least. US wheat exports are a bit higher than a year ago at this point, and Canadian exports are down about 12% from a year ago. And again, just a reminder to check on those forward contract price opportunities for something that may be interesting and profitable to forward price at. Although usually a better idea to do that with wheat in the bin than not in the bin. So it's just something to keep in mind. In terms of feed grains, on the feed grain market, world ending stocks of corn are also quite high. US corn yields have rapidly increased over the last few decades. Last year's yield was down to about 168 bushels an acre, but nonetheless, still a high corn yield and supportive for their production down there. U.S. corn ending stocks, although it was predicted to be dropping, that X provides the latest USDA estimate from April 9th's report. It's a monthly report that comes out from USDA, and the effect of the lower use of corn into the ethanol markets is being seen already. And so that is a bit of a negative, major negative that is for the corn market right now. Hasn't affected our feed grains here in Alberta much yet, but is one to keep in mind going forward. The May corn futures hit lows on Monday, down to $3 a bushel. Has since rebounded slightly, but nonetheless is down at the low levels. So that low price may inspire some exports of corn, as it might on some of the other crops of wheat and soybeans from the U.S. In terms of the barley market, we had a bit of a rebound the last couple of years in barley acreage in Canada, inspired by higher prices. But, and I wanted to point out here that our barley yields, although they have increased over time, have not risen to the same extent as corn, although it's certainly a different crop for breeding purposes and having those markets or those yields increase as the research efforts are made. In terms of Canadian barley production, a rebound this last year. It's going to be fairly well used, although our exports this year are down compared to a year ago. Our domestic use is higher than it was a year ago, so about an offset there. But nonetheless, we will see about an increase in our barley stocks, although not to what I would call burdensome levels, and the barley market is still quite well supported. The other factor to keep in mind is that Stats Canada had estimated in their crops for production in 2019, including in there the spring harvested levels. And that's a bit of a question mark yet, because we don't know how much of those crops will actually be harvested, how much was damaged, and what the quality will be, and how much will actually or has to be actually written off because of inaccessibility, wildlife damage, and flooding and those kinds of things. So there's a bit of a question mark there on their remaining crop to come out of that 2019 crop. Feed barley prices have been more or less flat since the rebound from last fall, and not terrible prices, but not fantastic either. So they are being hindered by the amount of feed grains that are out there, and that's likely to be increased soon once we get the harvest going again from last year. Just to sum up on barley then, we had those higher prices rebound from last fall's price. We had higher feed grain use for cow rations because of the lack of a good quality hay crop that last year. And then combined with straw, and the rations have gobbled up quite a bit of the grain. Also, we had higher Alberta, Saskatchewan cattle on feed numbers all winter. And so that has helped feed grain demand. U.S. corn prices are limited coming in because of the weak Canadian dollar, and also the east-west movement of grain into the eastern or the western ports. Forecasting, as I mentioned, feed grain weakness quite possibly as the spring harvest progresses, and a lot of the markets have already taken into account. Just a bit of a heads up for those of you still making your crop insurance decisions. Check into the barley price at $48 a bushel for the spring price. It's not necessarily a slam dunk for taking the spring price endorsement, and that factor on barley also affects the potential for spring price endorsement, at least a look at it for malting barley and also for oats, because they're tied to the feed barley price. Some comments on the oat market. A little bit higher acreage this last year. Production rebound as well, but then we had quite a bit of oats that was snowed under, and so that's a factor yet to be seen on what's the actual 2019 yield. We've had oat exports up somewhat from this last year from a Canada perspective, and domestic use is up 280,000 tons so far. So we've got a bit of a squeeze going on in the May contract in oats in the US, and that's because of the limitation of good quality oats. Also, I wanted to point out though that this oat market, unlike what I showed for wheat, is in an inverse market, we call it, where the deferred month of futures are lower in price, at least out to December, than the nearby or the nearby months. So That's an inverse market, and that's a situation that often develops in the futures when there's a relative shortage of supply. Just to summarize on oats then, difficult and incomplete harvest, tightness of the good quality oats. Import demand by the US is strong for our quality oats, and that's a competition for our local processors for sure. Wide-ranging oat prices, as is typical between or across Alberta, quality dependent all the way from $2 to $3.75 a bushel. The message there is know your quality, get it graded, and shop around widely. On that note, I do have a list of grain buyers and grain contacts that I'd be welcoming to send out to anybody who's interested in that. So just contact me with my email address to be provided in my last slide. Some comments on peas, record acreage this last year. The pea crop, as the farmers will know on the call, was looking wonderful until the rains came and it kept getting wet. And peas don't like being too wet, and so disease set in, and that clipped our yields to quite an extent this last year. It was our best looking crop until that event developed. In terms of production, StatsCan is still showing quite a large production. I'm not sure if it will be quite that large, and I think the market is starting to show that in terms of price here lately. Our exports have been doing rather well. We're up 400,000 tons crop year to date, with our main buyers being China, Bangladesh, India, and Cuba. Those markets have developed to a greater extent since India put the tariffs on that they did back in 2017. In terms of pea ending stocks, not burdensome at all the way it's shaping up. In terms of price, a bit of a rebound here lately. Some yellow prices have been as high as $7.80 a bushel, and feed prices have also increased from the early start in the winter. Just to summarize then on peas, the tariffs continue into India, but nonetheless, we've been sending a few peas that way despite that. And the lockdown that they had in India prevented the harvest from proceeding there, and that resulted in some pea price improvement as well. So as I mentioned, yellow bids are currently as high as $7.80 a bushel. By shopping around, it may be a fleeting opportunity. Greens are as high as $12 a bushel. Finally, though, after some frustration 2 or 3 years ago, the greens are outpricing the yellows again. And feed pea prices are still fairly attractive as well. Soybeans, as it relates to the oilseed markets, world ending stocks are quite high again, but down from what they were last year. US ending stocks have ratcheted down quite a bit, but nonetheless are still relatively high compared with history. World or US soybean prices are not great. They also hit recent lows last Monday, have since rebounded on rumors that China's back in the US market after getting most of their beans here lately from the South American suppliers. In terms of canola then, harvested acreage, I'm estimating about 20.5 million acres this last year. And some of that may not come off because of the way the winter has gone too in some areas. In terms of production, a little bit lower this last year, 18.6 million tons. And the good news on canola, we've got two fronts. We've got exports 300,000 tons higher than last year to date. Although last year, you'll remember that the difficulties with China began in early March, and so exports tailed off rather dramatically last year, and we'll see what happens this year. But currently, we're not able to export to China again, pending resolution of the current situation and discussions relative to the dockage level that China wants from our canola, and they want it less than 1% dockage. So that discussion continues before our trade with China opens up again. I wanted to show this graph. The vertical lines show the canola futures for March, and actually this is updated. It's actually supposed to be May, but anyway, it also compares it to the March soy oil, and I'm inserting there the May soy oil. But my point is I wanted to show you the relationship between soy oil and canola prices. Quite closely related. Our greatest value from canola crushing is the oil side. In terms of crush margins actually improved from where that red circle is, and that indicates last March 1st when China canceled the Richardson Pioneer import permit, and subsequently later than the Viterra permit to import into China. And so crush margins have fallen off lately. That's because oil share has dropped relative to what the value of the seed is. So in other words, canola prices have held up quite well relative to the seed price. In terms of domestic usage, it's another good news story. This year we're up with our domestic use by 800,000 tons year to date. And so we could well have a record crush this year. Ending stocks, I'm projecting 3.2 million tons. Some of the analysts, because of the way the exports are running and also more importantly, the domestic crush, suggesting that could fall down as low as 2.5 million tons. So that may be price supportive going forward here. Also dependent on how the spring harvest turns out in terms of quality for that canola. If it's going to be usable in the domestic market as crushers, or whether it's still mixed off to be exporters, or will it be 1, 2, 3-year sample. So a bit to be decided there in this next month or 6 weeks. In terms of the price, I guess held up reasonably well, but certainly fell off from a couple years ago, running generally around that $10 a bushel level, depending on which buyer and what day of the week and what month you're looking at for delivery. In terms of the futures, it's backed off here lately with the drop in the oil prices, which is affected in part by the crude oil prices because of the connection to the biodiesel industry. Wanted to point out the carrying charge in the canola market on the futures as well. Similar situation there. It's an opportunity to capture some carry sometimes, because as you move forward in time, that carry disappears. All it means is the market is paying the producer to store, or whoever is holding that canola to store it. Okay, so globally then, world oilseed supplies are still high, but not as high as earlier forecast. China continues that restriction on Canadian canola seed imports. We had a strong vegetable oil demand market until C19, but it's now turned weaker because of less oil being used in the fast food facilities and so on and so on. Also, we've got a good news story in that crushing industry, and that's continuing on this year, so that's a good thing. Another crushing plant would be great, but the crushing plants are probably hesitant to build more facilities right now with all the uncertainty out there in the world. Just to mention a few of the resources available through Alberta Agriculture, we have a weekly crop and livestock market review that's on the website and also available by direct email. There still is an Ag Info Center 310 Farmer 3276 number, although most of the specialist jobs, or all of them pretty much, have been cut in the last 6 weeks, so it's hard to find a specialist out there to talk to on a lot of the questions that they were fielding in the past. The website for reference is www.alberta.ca, and within that website you can search for Farm Manager, which contains information on marketing, financial management, production economics, and also our marketing guides. So if you just do a search on that master website for marketing guide, you'll find information and articles on various aspects of marketing. Another thing to mention is agri-profits and crop choices, which specifically for crops and agri-profits, more generally for also cow-calf, has information on economics and decision-making crop choices program that's downloadable to help you with your cropping decisions. It incorporates your crop insurance coverage levels and so on, so that's worth a look if you can take the time to look at that sometime. So with that, I'd like to field any questions if there are any at this time.
Thank you, Neil. Are there any questions about crops and the crop market analysis? I think we're good. Not hearing or seeing any. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Neil. That was a great presentation. We appreciate the overview and the insight. I did have one other question just around grain storage for the fall. Somebody was wondering just kind of if you have any insights, is there going to be enough capacity for everyone to store, or Are you seeing any problems, or you think everything will find markets and get to where it needs to in your crystal ball?
Well, from a inventory carryover point of view, I wouldn't really call it burdensome on any of the crops in particular. So that's good from the point of view of the commercial facilities. The other thing that, as I mentioned, is caught up lately is grain movement. So the export market is doing quite a bit better lately, and that's a bit of a positive if there is such a thing that's coming out of the COVID-19 situation. So at this point, I don't really see a major problem. On-farm storage has generally been well developed over the last number of years as well, and farmers have become fairly well adapted for temporary storage using grain bags and other temporary storage mechanisms. So I don't really see a problem offhand. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, well, we will, we certainly have time for any discussion. However, oops, pardon me, we've had a lot of people needing to get out into their fields, and it's been such a nice day that everyone's kind of getting back to work here. So I think we'll probably wrap things up today, unless there are any further questions or comments that anyone would like to share. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone, especially our presenters. We're doing lots of test Zoom meetings and everything to get everybody up to speed, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your information and your knowledge with us. Just seeing one. Do we have a question? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we are going to be wrapping up, and but we are going to be wanting to continue discussions in the agribusiness sector. So my information is there. If you have any other further comments or questions, please send them to us. We'll be creating some working groups to continue these discussions with our key stakeholders and businesses in Sturgeon County farms. Excuse me, and Amy will be sending out a link later today, just a quick 2-minute survey. What did you think of today's webinar, and if there's anything you can think of to help us constructively for any future engagements, that would be great. So thanks so much for your time today. Enjoy this beautiful weather, and enjoy your day and stay safe. Thank you.